Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our panel, and each panelist will talk for around 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll all start asking some questions, and we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll open up to questions from the public. First off, on my right is Terry Glavin. Terry Glavin has worked as a reporter, a columnist, editor for a variety of newspapers. His assignments have taken him to Afghanistan, Israel, the Russian Far East, the Himalayas, China, and Central America. He's the author of several books and the co-author of 3. His books have been published all around the world, and he was the recipient of the 2009 BC Lieutenant Governor's Award for Literary Excellence. His most recent book is the just-published Come From the Shadows, The Long and Lonely Struggle for Peace in Afghanistan. Please welcome Terry Glavin. Next to Terry is David Harris. Many of you may know David from his appearances on CFRA and on many other news networks. But David has 3 decades in the field of experience in international security and intelligence. He's a lawyer. He's involved in a whole variety of national security issues. And he's the director of the International and Terrorist Intelligence Program in Cygnus Strategic Research. He's consulted on a variety of projects for Canada, and he's consulted and served with Canadian Security Intelligence Services from 1988 to 1990. He's a regular commentator all around the world on a variety of networks: Sun News, CNN, Fox, 60 Minutes, Dateline, The Today Show. He does the Intelligence File on CFRA, and I'm really proud to have David Harris. Next to David is my friend Scott Simon. Scott is a professor at the University of Ottawa, and he specializes in the political anthropology of indigeneity and the development in the Austronesian communities of Taiwan. So he gets to spend a lot of time in Taiwan. He's an expert in that country. He's a big supporter of Taiwanese rights, and he serves as the co-editor of the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. He's the author of 2 books on the social and political dimensions of development in Taiwan, and he's currently the president of the Canadian Asian Studies Association. Welcome, Scott Simon. Next to Scott is a tireless campaigner for human rights in this country. David Kilgour is the co-chair of the Canadian Friends of a Democratic Iran. He's the past chair of the Latin American Caribbean Policy Working Group of the Ottawa branch of the Canadian International Council. He's a director of the Washington-based Council for a Community of Democracies. He's a fellow of the Queen's University Center for the Study of Democracy, and he's a director of the New York-based NGO Advancing Human Rights and a director of the Ottawa Mission Foundation. David served in the House of Commons for many, many years. He was Deputy Speaker and Chair of the Committees of the whole House. He was Secretary of State for Latin America and Africa from 1997 to 2002, and Secretary of State for Asia Pacific 2002 to 2003. In 2009, David published with David Matus, Bloody Harvest, The Killing of Falun Gong for Their Organs, and that he was awarded the 2009 Human Rights Prize of the International Society for Human Rights in Switzerland for raising awareness of state-sponsored organ pillaging in China. Please welcome David Kilgour. And to the right of David is Jason Loftus. Jason is the Deputy Publisher and Chief Editor of the Epoch Times in Canada, which publishes the #1 daily newspaper for the mainland Chinese immigrant community, as well as weekly editions in English and French. Globally, the Epoch Times is available in 12 languages and 35 countries. The paper's editorial serves series 9 commentaries on the Communist Party, won Best Asian American Feature Online from the Asian American Journalists Association. The paper's been recognized by a variety of people. I think every journalist in major newspapers checks the Epoch Times to see what kind of stories are important they themselves should be working on. He's been with the Epoch Times since it launched its English publication in Canada in late 2004. Please welcome Jason Loftus. So our topic for tonight is China in Canada, and I think I'll start with Jason at the far end to talk about what China's doing in Canada.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I thought that was an interesting film, and I guess bringing it closer to Canada, obviously our situation is different, but China is a very hot topic here as well, particularly with the investments going on in the oil sands and in many areas. I just wanted to, I think my colleagues on the panel probably have lots of detailed insights in different areas. I just wanted to, from the perspective of the Epoch Times, I just wanted to grab a couple headlines for stories that we actually were watching just today, just to give people a flavor of intuitively when we talk about Chinese investment and China gaining leverage in Canadian society, I think there are some people who are uneasy about that, understandably. And when we talk about state-owned enterprises, doing those investments, that's even perhaps more worrisome, particularly when that's a state or a regime that doesn't necessarily share our values. So let's just look at a couple of examples from stories we were following today that give us a little taste. And I mean, these are stories, we follow the likes of these all the time, but I was just watching today. In Alberta, you may have seen, it was raised in the legislature today by the opposition party, but there are concerns with regards to the cancellation of a couple of Chinese cultural performances at major theaters in Alberta. This is the Shenyang Performing Arts Show. And the opposition party raised concerns about this, about whether the Alberta government was bullying this performance group. But I think the context is very important because we've been following this story. So actually, this group mentioned, the organizers of the Shenyang Performing Arts mentioned that as far back as 2009, the management of the theater there had mentioned that the Alberta government was pressured by the Chinese, the consulate in Calgary, to not rent their theater to the Shenyang Performing Arts. And we know that in 2008, actually, Canadian Press had an article saying that indeed the Tourism Calgary had canceled a show, canceled their participation in that same performance because of pressure from the Chinese regime. So, I mean, this is something it's in the news today. People are talking about it, and I think it's this is just an example of the type of influence and the type of concerns we may have with regards to China. Another example today. There's a young lady named Sonia Zhao in Toronto who's just filed a human rights complaint against McMaster University. And maybe a lot of people here are familiar with the Confucius Institutes that have been sort of spurting up at different university campuses across Canada and other institutions. In fact, the Toronto District School Board is going to host one. And basically this lady, she brought forward documents showing that she was forced to sign, in order to get her teaching position at McMaster, she was forced to sign a document saying that she wouldn't engage in her beliefs of Falun Gong while she was teaching at McMaster here in Canada. So I think just these couple of examples, the concerns about the influence, a foreign regime telling us what we should and shouldn't be watching at a cultural venue here, in our country, if that's indeed the case. And this example here of this, this lady at an educational institution here in Canada. So does that mean that we should just cut off all of our exchanges with China and we shouldn't interact with them and we should close the door? I think what we can do is be more intelligent and be more informed in terms of how we do deal with the Chinese. And I'd like to just point to a couple of examples where I feel that informed behavior hasn't necessarily been at the fore. Recently our Prime Minister met with Bo Xilai. And anyone who's been following China recently, you've seen this very charismatic leader. David Kilgour knows him very well because he featured quite prominently in the organ harvesting report. A little bit of an unsavory character, I'd say, in the least. But this gentleman, our Prime Minister, was meeting with him just as his political fortunes were really collapsing around him. His deputy, his police chief, his right-hand man, had already made an attempted defection to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. And basically, our reports, we'd been saying that this guy's on the way out. He's going to be taken down. He didn't even have a national portfolio, but our Prime Minister made the effort to go and meet with him. And part of that, I think, is because of the relationships that our officials had with Bo Xilai, and perhaps ignoring his background and his past. A few weeks later, our Prime Minister, our Governor General, and Carleton University each hosted Li Changqun. I'm not sure if people know this guy. He's buddies with Bo Xilai. They've both faced a few lawsuits for torture when they travel abroad from victims of persecution. But this individual is interesting because he actually holds no position in the government. So why was our Prime Minister and our Governor General hosting this person? And actually, the only position he holds is he's a Communist Party propaganda chief in China. And he came to Carleton University to christen the opening of the Confucius Institute, which I mentioned, was in the news again today. So, I mean, from that perspective, the Confucius Institutes are supposed to be, centers for cultural and language exchange. And in this sense, we've got someone who's, it's not a cultural attaché, it's not the education minister, it's the propaganda minister of the Communist Party. And I think whenever someone's asking, for a quiet meeting, don't inform the media, which is what happened with this visit, that should raise alarms. So I think that our government can be more informed in terms of who it deals with and how it deals with major figures in China. And if we know more of their backgrounds and what they stand for and where they want to take China, I think that we can be more intelligent in terms of how we engage them. So.
Okay, David Kilgour.
Can you hear me at the back? Is there anyone here from Zambia here tonight? Because I hope that he or she will get up afterwards and talk about the film. But I don't see anyone raising a hand. So, sorry? Somebody, will you get up, please, afterwards and say something about the film, sir? Okay. Fred is a very tough guy, as you probably sense, so I have a longer paper, but I'll try to just give the highlights to get under the 5 minutes, Fred. What China's party state is doing in natural resist nations like on the continent of Africa today, notably Zambia, as we saw, has clear parallels with what happened earlier in Africa under the European colonial empires. But our assigned task is to talk about what Chinese investment is doing to Canadians. So I'd like, if I may, refer very briefly to part of a survey in The Economist 3 months ago on state capitalism. The Economist magazine said, state capitalism sees itself as an alternative to liberal capitalism by fusing on the power of government-owned companies through mechanisms such as listing government-owned companies on international stock markets. The Chinese party state is the largest shareholder in the country's 150 largest companies and directs thousands of others. Secondly, a culture of corruption permeates the China's economy today, with Transparency International ranking China far down its list at 75th place on the Perceived Corruption Index for 2011. The Economist quotes the Central Bank of China itself estimate that between the mid-90s and 2008, some 16,000, ladies and gentlemen, to 18,000 Chinese officials and executives of state-owned companies, quote, made off with a total of $123 billion. The Economist survey concludes, quote, by turning companies into organs of the government, state capitalism simultaneously concentrates power and corrupts it, close quote. Premier Wen Jiabao, I happen to admire him and think he's trying to do a lot of good things, especially lately. He said quite recently, quote, without the success of political structural reform, it's impossible for us to fully institute economic structural reform. The gains we have made may be lost. New problems that have cropped up in China's society cannot be fundamentally resolved, and things such as the Cultural Revolution, he said, may happen again, close quote. Wen, by the way, has since said that the state-controlled banks are a monopoly that must be broken. Just a couple of thoughts on governance. The book, The Party, was published in 2010 by Richard McGregor, who was the Beijing bureau chief for the Financial Times. Just a couple of points he makes, which I think you should hear. Quote, top leaders adhere to Marxism in their public statements, even as they depend on a ruthless private sector to create jobs. Did we see something about that on the screen a little while ago? The party preaches equality while presiding over incomes as unequal as anywhere in Asia. And you may have noticed that the hand-picked delegates at the recent National People's Congress, among them were 61 billionaires, hand-picked by the Communist Party. At the recent conference on Tibet in Ottawa, addressed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, there were parliamentarians, as I hope you know, from 30 countries participating. Among the points made by a number of China experts, I'll mention just a couple. Public anger about social, political, and economic conditions across China is growing, with 180,000 public protests reported during 2011 alone. One-party authoritarian governance has no democratic legitimacy. The so-called performance legitimacy will disappear overnight if the economy stalls, and I believe it will be precipitated by a bursted housing bubble. Dealing effectively with government corruption requires multi-party democracy, independent judges, and the rule of law. And then this, all of the candidates for membership of the Standing Committee of the party, including the President-designate, suffered during the Mao's Cultural Revolution. They all know that modern societies are democracies, and that Premier Wen is correct, that without political reform, China faces a dead end. The self-explosion of Bo Xilai, which Jason, you put very well, and others demonstrated to the world the flaws of political Leninism, including monumental corruption. Now, Canada. Some of you might remember that in 2004, a company called China Minmetals wanted to take over a bid to take over Noranda, which was then our largest mining company in Canada. It became evident that Minmetals was in fact not even an incorporated company. It was a branch of the mining department in Beijing. So some of us pointed out that that takeover would constitute the nationalization of Canada's largest private mining company by the government in Beijing, and they quickly disappeared. And I'm not saying for a moment it's perfectly acceptable to buy products, including bitumen, oil, and gas, and I'm from Alberta. But it's quite another to acquire the firms that produce such exports, as you're going to hear, I think, from the other speakers. I'm absolutely delighted that Elizabeth May is here. And Elizabeth, I'm going to quote you. Oh, where is she? Oh, sorry. Tell me if I've misquoted you, Elizabeth. You recently said, quote, any enterprise that is owned by another nation state raises sovereignty issues, but in the case of China, the security advisors to the government of China for a long time have expressed particular concern about Chinese influence. Is that an accurate quote?
The government security advisors to Canada.
Oh, sorry, thank you.
That's right.
You'll get equal time in a minute. Okay. Yes, this is, I think, extremely important. You may have pointed this out, too. The Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, which is not usually very hostile to the government of China, released an opinion survey saying that 3/4 of Canadians are opposed to Chinese state-owned companies gaining controlling stakes in Canadian firms. How many of you would take the same view? Could you raise your hands? Is that 75%, 3/4? Anybody here favor Chinese government-owned firms taking over ownership? Please note there's not a single hand up. Okay, I know you're looking at your watch, Fred. And I'll leave to Terry Glavin. I've got about 75 copies of his brilliant article this morning. If anyone would like to take it afterwards, I'll leave it on the counter or something. You're going to talk about... yes. I know Elizabeth wants us not to cut down trees, but it's front and back. One page. Good use of paper? Okay. Governments of open societies and our private sectors might examine why we are supporting the violation of so many universal values in order to increase trade and direct investment from China. For years, as you all know, this has resulted mostly in Canadian jobs being outsourced to China and continuous increases in our bilateral trade current account deficits, presently about $31 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Fair trade, the Peter Navarro at the University of California, whom I happen to admire a lot, he says that consumer markets worldwide have been conquered by China largely through cheating. Navarro has various proposals intended to ensure that trade with China becomes fair, and I'll just give you a couple. He's got a bunch, but one is to define currency manipulation as an illegal export subsidy, which it certainly is, and add it to other subsidies when calculating countervail penalties. And respect intellectual property, adapt and enforce health, safety, and environmental regulations consistent with international norms. And there's a thing at the bottom about the national environment. Protect the natural environment in all trade agreements. Okay, the Communist Party is currently making major changes in its senior leadership. I'm actually very encouraged by what seems to be happening. We'll talk more about that. Those appointed should seek dignity for all citizens of China. And of course, like you, I have great respect for the people of China if they wish to achieve sustainable prosperity. Beijing's conduct internationally, and I'm thinking tonight of Syria, also requires major changes if a new government's goal is to build world harmony. Finally, Mr. Fred, the Chinese people want exactly the same things as Canadians and the rest of us of the world: respect and education for all, safety and security, sustainable jobs, the rule of law, democratic governance, and a sustainable natural environment. If the party begins to treat all members of the human family in a transparent and equitable way, the new century can bring peace and prosperity for China and the world. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
And Scott Simon. Scott?
Okay, first of all, I'm delighted to see so many people come out tonight, and I'm glad that Elizabeth May is here with us for this film and for our talk. I have lived for 2 years in China and 8 years in Taiwan. While I was living in China, I had the pleasure of living in university housing with African students. I learned quite a bit about the situation of African students in China, and there's actually quite a bit of racism there. And I think we saw a little bit of that in the film today. Maybe it was difficult to pick up some of it, but at the very beginning, Hu Jintao made a speech in which he said that China and Africa are both cradles of humanity. And I think it's important to notice the plural there, which is important because the official line in China is that there are multiple sources of humanity rather than believing that everybody evolved from the same ancestor in Africa. And that reveals an underlying racism that they don't want to recognize that their ancestors came from Africa like everybody else. And in fact, they believe that the Chinese are superior to the rest of the world, and that's something that the African students are very aware of. Many Africans, however, believe that China would be an alternative to colonialism, and I think this film shows, with everything from Chinese farmers to state firms, that in fact it's a continuation of colonialism. Now, as a scholar of Taiwan, I'm most concerned about China's territorial ambitions, and I think we have to keep that in mind here tonight. China maintains its domestic legitimacy with a nationalist ideology of irredentism, which means they claim that China has unfairly lost several territories and can restore national pride only by retaking them. China consistently threatens military means to enforce its claims outside of its borders, and that includes not only Taiwan, which I think is very well known, but also the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, some Japanese islands, and a broad swath of what they call the South China Sea. These are all claims that have already been settled by international treaties. And I think these issues are linked with the oil issue, which we'll be talking about this evening. China needs stable energy supplies in order to fuel its military ambitions. And if Canadian business and political leaders prioritize economic ties, including promotion of Chinese energy investment, I think Canada is more likely to appease China than to prevent its expansion. And Jason, thank you for pointing out some of the poor information that I think some of our leaders have. University of Alberta professor Zhang Wenran, author of The Dragon Returns Canada in China's Quest for Energy Security, argues that Chinese import of Canadian oil by replacing oil-based energy will reduce global carbon emissions. Dr. Zhang argues that China's industrial growth and expansion of the middle class, which have made China into the world's largest auto market, mean that China must meet ever-expanding energy needs to avoid social unrest. the Chinese state has thus required its energy companies to expand abroad. I think Elizabeth and I probably share a similar goal that we would probably reduce our own reliance on automobiles, including China and Canada. But anyway, back to the oil companies. There is a difference in the way in which China invests in Canada and elsewhere. Most countries favor what Dr. Zhang calls loan for energy supply. In Russia, Kazakhstan, Brazil, and Venezuela, China gives loans in return for long-term supply contracts. Dr. Zhang calls this, and I quote, an optimal outcome that China provide the financing while they remain in control of the energy assets. Even Taiwan, which is growing closer economically to China, protects its energy assets. Taiwan limits Chinese investment to oil and natural gas exploration services, petroleum products, wholesaling, and fuel retailing. China hopes to expand oil exports to China and has been working toward joint exploration and production agreements with Chinese oil companies, but is not willing to sacrifice ownership of strategic energy assets. And I think that Terry will be speaking about that. In this regard, Canada is very different, as we've seen with the sale of Daylight Energy to Sinopec. They bought 100% of that firm. I thus concur with Terry Glavin and Elizabeth May that Canada risks its energy sovereignty with the sale of such assets. And we should note that there is absolutely no reciprocity here. China does not permit foreign companies to purchase oil and energy assets in China, requiring instead that potential investors form joint ventures with Chinese companies. As Elizabeth May said, these are not free enterprise corporations subject to rules and regulations of a like-minded country. The import of Chinese labor standards is another risk. In 2007, Sinopec imported some 150 Chinese workers to build a storage tank on Canadian Natural Resources Horizon project. 2 workers died and 2 were injured when the roof of the tank collapsed. The remaining workers were sent home. After investigation, Alberta laid 53 charges against Canadian Natural Resources and Sinopec for failing to protect workers' safety. The trial was delayed repeatedly, with Sinopec insisting that they have no legal presence in Canada and that a Canadian court summons is thus invalid. Furthermore, it was found that the Chinese workers were paid only a fraction of their promised wages. Dr. Zhang thinks that the main problems for Chinese investment in Canada's oil sands are that, as he says, labor costs are high, oil sands extraction is expensive, and the regulatory approval process is lengthy and complicated, unquote. He calls for more favorable terms. If more favorable terms mean lowering labor and environmental standards, importing cheap labor from China, and sacrificing our long-term energy sovereignty, I must disagree with Dr. Zhang. And so I would make a few policy suggestions. First of all, I think that our Prime Minister Harper has promised a foreign investment protection agreement with China, and I think that that should be evaluated very carefully along with any future legislation, with long-term energy security as a most important priority. And I think we have to depend on our MPs to take care of that. We should not sacrifice our sovereignty by permitting China's state firms to sue federal, provincial, and local governments because they feel that policies negatively influence their profits. On a related issue, some BC First Nations have signed agreements with China, and we should not allow China to opportunistically circumvent Canadian law in the name of Aboriginal sovereignty. And I say that as somebody who teaches Indigenous rights and is a very strong supporter of Indigenous rights. Secondly, reciprocity. We should not sell our energy assets to Chinese firms as long as we cannot do the same investments in China. We should wait until we can make reciprocal agreements with a democratic and free China. Thirdly, a foreign worker program. I think we really should think carefully about what we're doing with foreign labor. We should ensure that Canadian labor standards are upheld, and I would hope that we can find a way to ensure that those jobs in the oil sands go to unionized Canadian workers. In conclusion, if Canada permits China to invest in Canadian energy assets, guaranteeing that our energy products end up in China rather than in global markets, we contribute to China's military rise. If we must sell energy assets to foreign companies, I therefore think that we should contribute to the energy security and economic prosperity of our closest allies. And this would mean promoting energy cooperation if we want the foreign investment in Canada. with Japan, with Taiwan, with India. All three of these countries have important oil industries, and the success of their energy companies also influences their relative geopolitical status. China's success or failure to enforce its territorial conflicts will determine if we all live in a world decided by irredentist claims and military might, or if we live in a world of peaceful cooperation, treaties, and international law. For the future of our planet and the well-being of future generations, I hope that Canada will strive for the latter. What we do with our oil sands does make a difference, so we should think carefully about that. Thank you.
David Harris.
Well, thank you, Fred, and kudos for bringing in this film and raising yet another important subject in the series of many that you've raised. As I watched the film, I found I had a number of thoughts come to mind, associations, I suppose, in the mind. One was a thought of Orwell's Animal Farm and how things shift quite quickly and how values shift with them. The other had to do with that wonderful Marxist expression, the comprador class. How you have elites of various descriptions, political, business, and otherwise described and determined, more than merrily willing to sell out their countries and various parts of those countries and associated values. And then finally there was a thought about a wonderful tombstone, I gather somewhere in France, and belonging to a dead Frenchman who was a surrealist, a surreal artist. And I think his tombstone read something like, in the end, it is always other people who die. I can't help but think that in the end we've been brought up, we've really been conditioned to imagine that it is other people who are colonized. I think we're going to be having a rude awakening for those of us who decide to pay attention and decide properly to police those of aspiring comprador classes who exist among us. We have to look at the challenge that China represents, and there may indeed be some bright lights somewhere in the future, but I suggest to you the future is so far removed from the present in this regard that we need to have a bracing reminder of reality now and then in that regard. There are a number of immediate challenges that we face in relation to some of the themes to which I've alluded earlier. First of all, of course, there is the issue of ownership, especially of some of the crucial assets with regard to which some of my colleagues have mentioned and that my colleague Terry, of course, will go into in considerably more detail. The oil issue has arisen, particularly in relation to the oil sands. And it has been absolutely astonishing to follow the various memoranda, the press releases and so on from Chinese-related companies boasting about the billions upon billions of dollars of sales by Canada to Chinese interests. And here again, we have to do some very considerable thinking. Yes, we must be absolutely on our guard against Chinese state-run companies. But no, that is not the end of the affair where companies are concerned, because companies, as in the case of individuals who come from totalitarian regimes, can be placed under the influence of those regimes owing to family and business and investment connections that may remain in that totalitarian country and may offer an opportunity of leverage against individuals and companies that may find themselves, in a very well-meaning sense, I might add, here in Canada. We must be rather unsentimental and completely aware of the implications of what I'm offering when I talk about that. This also extends to individuals, particularly because the Chinese intelligence apparatus, as many expatriate Chinese in Canada will remind us, with increasing degrees of concern, frustration, and consternation, are tremendously active. We are looking at possibly thousands of Chinese intelligence assets in this country. And as you will know, if you get citizenship in this country, you have certain entitlements. And they include the ability to find employment in a wide variety of sectors, not least in our government and in security-related areas. Bear this in mind. It has implications, and that includes, of course, for government and the way government is conducted. We also have to be aware, as we look at such things as some of these oil sales, that we seem to have done an excellent job in recent years of gutting the provisions, the means by which we would determine whether national interest, national security, or some other priority should be applied to decision-making about whether to accept or not proposals to sell our all-important assets that we might not readily be able to get back. And we must not be naive in relation also, and in this regard, to the fact that we may have some self-styled Canadian oil companies involved in some of the relevant maneuvers. Because if you take a look at some of the boards of directors, you will find individuals who have not simply come from China, but are also apparently intimately connected to the Beijing regime and all that that implies. So there are a series of issues that we have got to contend with, and they range, of course, from coming to appropriate regulatory arrangements and frameworks, to dealing realistically with our immigration situation, and to keeping the closest possible eye, without fear or favor, upon all of our political leaders at the federal level, provincial level, municipal level, and beyond, and of course our corporate leaders as well. Because it is, in the end, the simple fact that we cannot assume that we have any friends in those realms. Neither can we assume that we have enemies, but we certainly have our own interests that we must see respected as a sovereign nation. Thank you.
And lastly, my friend Terry Glavin.
Thanks very much for having me, Fred. When one sits on such an august panel, one rarely knows exactly what sort of contribution to the conversation one should make, but I'm going to give it a shot. I bring, I think, a little bit of a different sort of a perspective to this story, and I consider this a very personal story. For me, this issue is extremely personal. It's about family, it's about where I grew up, and it's about a great deal of what I've believed in my life. I come from British Columbia. We're a little bit odd out that way. We talk about Western civilization, that's someplace to the east of us. When you guys talk about the mysterious east, that's actually to the west of us, and we don't find it particularly mysterious at all. I grew up along the Fraser River, Burnaby, New Westminster, sawmills, canneries, very Cantonese landscape. That's where it was the most productive farmland in Canada. The Cantonese farms along the Lower Fraser River. I'm an immigrant, came from an immigrant family, Irish immigrants via England. Our first landlord in Canada was a man by the name of Mr. Bing. And every time I write a story about workers in China, about human rights in China, and I hit send and it goes off to the Ottawa Citizen, I say, this one's for you, Mr. Bing. The extent to which, you see, you got to remember another thing about, and it's an Irish thing, I think, too, is that poor Paddy, who worked upon the railway west of the Rockies, actually came not from County Wicklow or County Kilkenny, but the 5 counties at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta in what is now Guangdong. 85% of all the immigration to Canada that we used to call we now call Chinese, they're basically Thai Chinese. They're from those 5 counties. And I am proud to report that as the Year of the Dragon began this year, the center of Chinese insurrectionism was in those 5 counties at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong. And I feel sort of personally proud of that. Those are my people. Those are our people. And one of the things I've noticed about how this conversation about China has been infantilized is the way the business class will attempt to shut it down by calling anybody who notices these contradictions a xenophobe. And I will not have anyone take that tone of voice with me. And I suggest to everyone here that you not allow that filthy insinuation to shut down what is possibly the most important Canadian conversation that Canadians have to have amongst themselves. Certainly the most important shift in our economic policy, our energy policy, and our foreign policy since the Pierre Trudeau, Mitchell Sharp third option of the early 1970s. This is a very big deal. When we talk about the incursion of Chinese state-owned enterprises into Canada, we're talking about the acquisition of key spigot points in Canada's oil industry, key assets in Canada's energy sector by the overseas acquisitions arms of the Politburo of the Communist Party of China, the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. That investment has increased 14-fold over the last 5 years. I don't even know where to begin. On the West Coast, we get really angry with the idea of the shipment of raw logs out of the province without even putting it through a planer mill or a sawmill. 40% of all the timber cut on the coast now is now shipped off raw. It's the Chinese share of that has grown tenfold in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, we were shipping about $83 million worth of coal to China. Last year, we shipped more than $1 billion worth of coal to China. The investment in the oil and gas industry, and I say this to my good friends in the Conservative Party, particularly those from Alberta, to reflect upon that Orwellian peculiarity that only a few years ago we were convinced by Alberta Conservatives that Petro-Canada was the unseemly nationalization of our oil and gas industry by a socialist behemoth, and that was a bad thing, but suddenly somehow it's all right and it's okay that PetroChina is nationalizing our oil and gas industry. I don't quite get it. 5 years, $20 billion. 5 years, $20 billion later, and there's always an excuse. Well, it's jobs. When the China Investment Corporation bought a big piece of tech industries, well, what the heck, you know, it's only 17%. Besides, it's $300 billion in offshore funds. Half of that American funds as a consequence of currency manipulation, and they may be opening an overseas office in Toronto, their first overseas office, and yes, indeed, that's what they did. When Sinopec bought Daylight Energy shares were trading for $4.89. That Friday, they paid $10 a share. They paid twice what it was worth. Everybody's happy, the oil patch is flush, and any pangs of guilt around the cabinet table are easily assuaged. There's always an excuse, and just as you know, you can't really foretell the lash that will cause the slave to turn on his master. In a police state like China, it's actually not that easy. In a democratic country like Canada, with all that dirty money greasing so many palms, to know the coin in which palm is the one that marks the transaction, that a country sells the last shred of its decency and its sense of solidarity with the people of China. Thousands and thousands of little Arab Springs are erupting now in China every week. We owe a duty of solidarity to the people of Tibet, of occupied Tibet. We owe a duty of solidarity to the workers in those 5 counties at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta. We owe a duty of solidarity to the Uyghurs of China, to the Christians of China, to the practitioners of Falun Gong in China. This is still a democratic country. It's my country, and I'm a Canadian, and I will not have anyone call me a xenophobe when I raise these issues. I will not have anyone speak to me in that tone of voice. With that, I think I'll just let it go before I get more worked up. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Terry. I'd like to ask the panel, when the Conservatives came to power, there was a bit of a shift that seemed initially that the Conservatives were a bit hostile to the Beijing regime, and in Conservative policy, there was a Conservative policy not to ship raw bitumen to China. What's happened? Things seem to have changed. What's happened? Anybody?
Belonged to both the Conservative and the Liberal parties for 15 years each. And having resigned from the Liberal Party over the sponsorship scandal, I guess I could give you a perspective on that, but you'll get 4 other perspectives and many others when we get to the questions. I think Mr. Harper was very upset when President Obama blocked the pipeline, the one that would have taken, and I wonder how many of you know, ladies and gentlemen, I know I sound like an Albertan, but oil from Alberta is actually being sold at, Elizabeth, is it $30 less a barrel in Oklahoma than it would get if it was sold somewhere else, because if it's locked in. That pipeline is extremely important, believe it or not, for jobs for Canadians generally, that we'd be able to get the full international price for that oil. So I think Mr. Harper was extremely unhappy about that, and he decided, I sense, that therefore let's have the pipeline to the coast, and the oil can go to China or India or wherever. I have a feeling that if you don't let Elizabeth speak on this, that she's...
I think this has been the issue that's truly perplexed me. I was actually quite proud of my government, a conservative government, by being one of the few countries in the G20, certainly at the World Trade Organization, that would insist on raising human rights issues in China. I don't actually buy the proposition that it was all because of the Keystone Pipeline and Obama's refusal to approve it, because he actually didn't refuse to approve it. I think it's a good point. I think the relationships between the White House and Sussex Drive are as bad as they've been in probably decades. That's a big part of it. And I think also the American irrational and belligerent refusal to welcome Canada into the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement has a lot to do with it. But I suspect that I know that something very peculiar happened in September 2009 with the regulations that were appended to the Investment Canada Act. There was once a cross-party agreement in Ottawa that we should draw a clear distinction between ordinary investment in Canada's natural resources sector, takeovers of Canadian firms, and state-owned enterprises like China Minmetals taking over Canadian firms. And then in those regulations, the decision somehow was made that no distinction should be drawn between private investment and the overseas acquisitions arms of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. The investment community and the intelligence community recommended that there be a clear definition of national security in the public benefit test, the net benefit test. Cabinet said no, there wouldn't even be a definition of national security. There would be no criteria, no objective, concrete definition of these terms. And the regulations were basically rigged in September 2009 to allow state-owned enterprises to fly underneath the radar. And in the case of Syncrude, the largest player in the oil fields, Sinopec acquired for $4.65 billion by a purchase of ConocoPhillips an effective veto over whether or not bitumen would be processed in Canada, North America, or China. So my guess is that a lot of this has got to do with the Conservatives waking up one morning and saying, holy gosh, look what's happened. Nobody was watching the shop. Now what are we going to do? We'll have to throw our entire legislative agenda up in the air and deal with this issue, or just, what the heck, let's make life uncomfortable for the handsome, swaggering, liberal, democratic incumbent in the White House. Well, you know which way it went.
David?
Perhaps, I have no clear answer any more than anyone else would as to what happened. What I have noted is the same, I think, that others who follow things closely have noted, and that is that the Conservative government had taken, I think, probably the most heroic approach, full of integrity and so on, to China in general, Chinese human rights in particular, and then the worm turned. Now, why did that happen? I cannot help but observe, and here I'll indulge in something that's in equal parts exotic and uncharming, otherwise known as plain English. I've noticed over the years that we have had, with increasing frequency, former deputy ministers, former ministers of the Crown, former prime ministers, racing off apparently to enhance their situations by engaging with various Canadian and Chinese business organizations. In one case, I recall a minister who was generally considered to be among the most reliable, who had the most profound of responsibilities on the public safety portfolio side of things. How can it be that we can have such people of such stature and especially of such access and influence engaging in this kind of way with a totalitarian government that is presumably at cross purposes in its fundamental interest to those national security and national interests that Canada decidedly has? I'm not sure, but there was something possibly illustrative that we should note very carefully, and that came in the form of the alleged sex and security scandal involving Mr. Deckert, you may recall, who was an assistant to a minister of the current government. There was a great deal of fuss surrounding this. Obviously, the most juicy of entertainments was at hand, sex and security, my goodness me. And we found that the Prime Minister, perhaps predictably for any Prime Minister found in a possibly embarrassing situation with a trusted colleague, decided that he was not going to press Mr. Deckert to resign or otherwise engage in a very noticeable and high-profile investigation. That much, as unacceptable as I frankly found it was on national security bases, was rather predictable. What I found particularly disturbing, and on a bad night maybe sinister, was the fact that, except for one question, the opposition, which had all the red meat it could ever have dreamt of in this case, said nothing. I spoke to an individual who was well placed in the Conservative Party, and I said, how on earth could one explain this kind of thing? This individual said to me in a response that I considered to have been unfair, but suggestive, she said to me, well, you have to remember, you have a House of Commons that is full of Deckerts. Again, I do not necessarily feel that this is altogether fair by any means, but I think it does encourage us to remember that we must remain on our guard. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. If anybody wants to ask a question, we've got 2 microphones, so if you want to line up behind the microphones to ask your question. I'll ask the panel, anybody here, should we be selling to China? Should we be buying from China? What should Canada be doing? I mean, is it okay that we buy Chinese products? What should we be doing?
Well, I think we have to do these things with our eyes open. And I mean, from the perspective of buying stuff from China, that's a topic we haven't really addressed, but that's got its own bundle of concerns with the amount of slave labor, et cetera, that goes on inside the Chinese, not penal system, but, the extrajudicial system where a lot of people are basically thrown in labor camps for any range of things. So there's a whole other set of issues with regards to buying from China.
David?
No, look, there are too many people waiting to ask questions.
Okay, so we're going to get to the questions, and I would ask people who want to ask a question, no speeches, please ask your question briefly so we can get through a lot of people. We'll start over here, sir, if you want to ask your question.
I would be interested to find out, each of you brought up some very interesting points in terms of aspects of violent and oppressive regimes. I believe, Jason, you mentioned there was some issues with... Okay, I'll ask a question. Can we effectively challenge a violent and oppressive regime when there is a deafening silence on another country that has heavily influenced our current government, who has been involved in a recent scandal involving our intelligence agency affecting some of our MPs with phone calls, secret flights to their country, a number of different human rights issues in Africa specifically? Can we effectively challenge China when there's a deafening silence on this other very influential country that's affecting Canada?
What country?
You tell me. You tell me what country is very affecting.
I hope this doesn't come across offensively, but I'm married to a Chinese woman who grew up under she was schooled in China, and I guess a lot of interesting stories. But this logic is actually one that the Communist Party puts forward when it teaches people. It says, until you're perfect, you've got a flaw, so you can't criticize me. You criticize me for rights or you criticize me for this, but you've got this problem and that problem. There's a pretty stark difference between the situation in Canada and a lot of other Western countries, and that that in China. So I would say I don't think we need to have a perfect system before we start raising things that are in line with our values. I think it's a given that we have to do that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Next question over there.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. Harris. Not so much, I know this country is important, but how severe is the infiltration by the Chinese on U.S. security right now?
Well, you may remember in 2010, Mr. Fadden, the CSIS director, had some intimations, at least, to share with us about China's influence. And what was striking at that time, I sat in on, I think it was the May 5th, 2010 hearings at Parliament on this, was the extent to which Fadden received virtually no support from MPs at the table, including Conservative MPs. This was a very striking situation. What was further of interest was the number of Canadian politicians, most notably to those who follow these things closely, with particularly proximate Chinese connections, who began shrieking about what Mr. Fadden had very correctly and appropriately warned, that China, like any number of other countries, are involved in influence operations, attempts to manipulate government and decision-making in ways congenial to the Beijing regime. I think the nature of that was of great concern. We've had defectors from China who have specified numbers in the thousands of penetrations here in Canada who are operating against us. We hear complaints from time to time from people of Chinese and other backgrounds about some of those working in our own federal government, including the Department of National Defense, who may have come from China and still have contacts in China, and that there may be some questions about how exactly we go about screening for people who've come from backgrounds that are really not accessible to our security agencies when it is time to have a look at those backgrounds. So it's a very difficult situation. We've got genuine interest, and I appreciate the question, because it's part of asking in a mature, sensible way what it is that we're dealing with.
Next question.
Thank you. My name is Spencer Berger. The gentleman to my left actually had my question, so I'll ask another. I guess this is more directed to Mr. Glavin and Mr. Kilgour, and Mr. Kilgour touched on this a little bit. And Mr. Glavin is someone who has respected many of your pieces on this issue, both in the Post, the Citizen, what have you. I just want to bring up a couple of realities that have only really been touched on. And this is saying as someone who does support a containment policy on China, I do believe in some form of investment restrictions, or at least ownership restrictions when it comes to state-owned companies. But having said that, there are two fundamental economic realities, which I think were only briefly touched on by Mr. Kilgour. One of which is we have an excess of refining capacity on this continent, and frankly, even globally. It is very difficult for Canadian secondary producers to really build on our primary products and either refine them or process them. When you brought up lumber, it's actually quite difficult for us to do that. We simply are not economically competitive enough in this area, especially when it comes to oil sands. The second economic reality is that when we sell our oil to the United States, we are actually selling it at a much more discounted price compared to selling it to China, India, what have you, as Mr. Kilgour touched on. So considering these two fundamental economic realities, how do we craft an economic policy that does acknowledge that we do need Chinese investment, we do need vast amounts of Chinese dollars, and we do need Chinese sales?
Okay.
But how do we deal with national security implications? Thank you.
The refinery question, you think we have an excess of refinery capacity in North America? We haven't had a new refinery built in North America for, 25 years?
But there's a reason for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I think that with was it $46 billion now in sales of bitumen and oil from the oil sands? It's an immense amount that we could get a couple more refineries out of that. I know there are people, and I guess you're one of them, who don't think we need another refinery, but I would certainly rather ship refined product rather than, as Terry said, shipping raw logs out of BC without even doing anything to them. I would. Maybe I'm talking like an Albertan.
Terry? These, I think you raise really valid points, and I don't want to dismiss them out of hand at all. I come to this from a slightly different point of view. I'm actually not convinced, because I don't really know anybody in the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers who's convinced that the strategy for ramping up bitumen production in Canada is actually necessary or that it's necessarily in the national interest. What I'm interested in is less speculation, and I know what I know. And what I know, for instance, about Sinopec, it's the 5th largest corporation in the world. It has revenues last year that exceeded the tax revenues of the government of Canada. It is the means by which that one company, Bashar al-Assad, has managed to maintain power in Sudan and is not in the prisoner's dock at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It is the bottomless bank draft of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Did I say Bashar al-Assad in Sudan? I meant Omar al-Bashir, pardon me. And the limitless credit line of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and it's also the most notorious sanctions buster in Iran that has entered into any number of multi-billion-dollar, multi-year agreements with corporations that are run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard in Iran. I don't care for these people, and I don't want my country doing business with these people, and I don't want them owning Crown-owned resources or private companies in Canada. Simple.
Elizabeth May, please.
Very tempted to at least make a comment that I wasn't in the House of Commons when I didn't find opposition members raising those issues, and that I remain astonished to this day that I seem to be the only member of Parliament raising these issues. Your answer that there's lots of Deckard's is, I suppose, revealing of that, but I'm not one of them. So my question is this. Scott Simon read out the complaint of China that our regulatory systems were too complicated or things took too long. We've seen the failure of the overseas investment provisions to include, when in the 2009 amendments, when we were looking at the Investment Canada provisions, to include any definition of national security. A deliberate decision was taken to turn away from even asking a question for objective criteria on national security. In Bill C-38 right now, we're seeing the destruction of environmental laws and reviews of projects, which are the very same things that China complained of. Recently, the Ontario Security Commission has found that Sino-Forest was violating and was vastly corrupt in its dealings in Ontario. And the Ontario Security Commission, if I remember the line from the report in the Globe and Mail business section, questioned whether we were not entirely too naive when we're dealing with overseas development dollars from China. My question is this. We're clearly eviscerating Canadian law in the interest of attracting Canadian dollars. Are we naive, or is it something much worse?
Anybody want to tackle that one?
I think she answered it herself.
Yeah, I think that was rhetorical, wasn't it?
David? Maybe it's time, as humble and deferential as I tend to be in these matters, maybe it's time for me to just suggest where the logic of some of my observations was leading. We need to make darn sure that we ourselves have the regulatory powers, the framework of rules vis-a-vis our decision makers that will really stick, and we've got to enforce those. So we have to make sure that post-retirement considerations are neatly gathered in. There is no ambiguity. People will know when they serve us, when they are privileged to serve us as our governors, when they're given the prestige, indeed the money and pension benefits and all the rest that goes with this, that they understand who their employer is throughout their term of service, and that there will be, as far as can be humanly determined, no benefit awaiting them at the end of the rainbow that is not provided for properly and in legal terms transparently and with accountability under our law and those regulations. So I would suggest, in fact, this may be an avenue to look at, to review the post-retirement aspects and so on. We have problems, not necessarily or only in this country, in relation to certain Gulf countries too, where, as some have pointed out in the United States, there seems to be a revolving door of former American Saudi ambassadors, or ambassadors to Saudi Arabia, who wind up in think tanks then funded by the Saudis or others. This is problematic. And this is not just a matter of nailing a potential scandal or an actual scandal. It's making provision for natural human temptations that can be out there and used as leverage. And the fact that we've got now so many ambiguities, and that excellent question that raises some further questions, it means that we've got to now attend to business in that kind of way. So I think that would be something I left out of my previous remarks.
Can I just add a footnote? Ladies and gentlemen, and Elizabeth, when Bo Xilai came to this city in 2007, David, you and I wrote an article asking why he was being allowed into Canada. I think you referred to this. He was the leader of the persecution of the Falun Gong in his state, and why Canada invited him here, and our trade minister at the time, David Emerson, took him all over town and made a lot of very, I thought, unwise statements about him. And as Jason also pointed out, why did our Prime Minister go and see Bo Xilai when he was obviously on his way out? I hope very much, ladies and gentlemen, that you'll watch this too. When David Mulroney is being withdrawn from Beijing as our ambassador there, and I hope that we'll get somebody, frankly, who will stand up for the values of Canadians, and will be somebody who will be giving much better advice to Prime Minister Harper about matters involving China.
Mr. Stockwell Day, when I last saw a notice of him, was a distinguished senior member of the Canada-China Business Council, a former, of course, Minister of Public Safety, responsible as a result of that for CSIS, the RCMP, and various other significant areas.
We're running out of time, so very, very briefly ask your question.
Yes. With China sending into Canada thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of students and visitors, how can we as Canadians identify which of those are potential spies or potentially here to harm us, not to help us?
Okay. Anybody?
Well, I know this raises an important question that applies to any number of countries in the world, because we have the biggest per capita immigration on the planet for reasons that are infinitely too involved for me to ever imagine or understand, given our 1.4 million unemployed, but that are frequently interpreted in terms of vote importing. The challenge that we face with any country that is under any kind of dictatorship is, again, that well-meaning people who come to this country to be loyal to this country might be leveraged by the dictatorship at home if there is the possibility of leverage through relatives and investments. We saw this, of course, with the Communist East Bloc. We're very familiar with this. And it may be an argument for doing what some moderate Muslims have actually suggested in relation to countries like Pakistan, Somalia, and other nations they describe as terror-producing nations, that is, of imposing moratoria or otherwise limiting the intake so that the numbers are manageable in relation to our security screening capacity. Remember that we only have 2,000 or 3,000 people, I think, at CSIS, and maybe a few thousand grand total who can look at immigration inflows. In the interest, I would suggest, of social cohesion and national security and so on, we may want to take this kind of thing into account.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to apologize. We're not going to have enough time for more questions because we have a limited time at this auditorium. I want to thank the panel for a great panel, so thank you very much. And please join us outside for a reception where you can talk to people privately.